The warning was taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve, like it was official, like it mattered, right next to a flyer for the neighborhood yard sale that half of Cedar Hollow condominiums had been planning for a month. I peeled it off, read it twice, and laughed out loud on my own porch at 9 in the morning. Violation notice, irrigation system noncompliance. Resident sprinkler system was observed running from 6:00 a.m. to 6:32 a.m. on Saturday, exceeding the permitted 6:00-6:30 a.m. watering window by 2 minutes. Fine, $75. Repeat offense may result in additional penalties. 2 minutes. I stood there in my socks holding a piece of paper that treated 2 minutes of sprinkler runoff like a felony, and about 40 feet away, half the units on my row didn't have water pressure strong enough to fill a coffee pot. My name's Jack Mitchell. I've been a volunteer firefighter for going on 11 years, which means I've seen actual emergencies, actual danger, actual things that matter. And I've also lived in Cedar Hollow long enough to know that the HOA board, specifically one woman named Gail Whitmore, thinks a 2-minute sprinkler overrun is a bigger crisis than a dead water main serving 6 units on the morning of the biggest community event of the summer. I want you to picture the scene, because context matters here. Cedar Hollow is a condo complex, 28 units total, narrow shared driveways, a parking lot that was clearly designed by someone who hated cars, and a common water line running under 3 of the 6 buildings that technically belongs to all of us collectively, according to the bylaws, though good luck getting anyone on the board to admit that when it's inconvenient. That Saturday was our annual community yard sale, the one where half the residents drag folding tables into the shared lot, price their old lamps and baby clothes and mystery kitchen gadgets, and the whole neighborhood turns into a swap meet/block party for 6 hours. Cars from 3 streets over come crawling through looking for bargains. Kids run around with lemonade stands. It's genuinely one of the few days a year Cedar Hollow feels like an actual community instead of a HOA fine factory. And on that morning, with driveways full of tables and strangers wandering the lot with their wallets out, 3 separate households discovered they had no water. Not low water. No water. The Hendersons in Building 2 couldn't run their bathroom faucet. The Alvarez family in Building 3 had a toilet that wouldn't refill. My neighbor Dana, 2 doors down from me, tried to hose off her folding tables before setting up and got a weak trickle followed by nothing. I checked my own water. Fine. Weak but fine. Which told me something specific, something a decade of pulling hose lines had trained me to notice. This wasn't a citywide issue. This was a pressure problem isolated to our shared line, the one that runs underneath buildings 2 and 3 and feeds into the older section of the complex. I walked over to the Hendersons' place still holding my ridiculous 2-minute violation notice because at that point it felt like a good prop for the argument I knew was coming. "You too," Mr. Henderson said, holding up a bucket like it was evidence in a trial. "Yard sale day and no water," I said. "Perfect timing." "Gail says it's fine," he said. "Says it's probably just somebody running their sprinklers too long." He looked at the notice in my hand and almost smiled. "Guess that's you, huh?" 2 minutes, I said. "I got fined for 2 minutes while your toilet doesn't work." We walked over together to find Gail, because in Cedar Hollow you don't call a plumber first, you go find Gail Whitmore first, whether you want to or not. Gail was already out by the mailbox kiosk in the center lot, clipboard in hand, wearing a visor that said HOA Matters in cursive, which I promise you is a real object that exists and that she owns. She's the kind of woman who introduces herself as the HOA president like it's a title bestowed by royal decree, instead of a volunteer position. 4 people begrudgingly voted her into 3 years ago because nobody else wanted the paperwork. "Gail," I said, holding up the notice, "we've got no water in 2 buildings and you're fining me for sprinkler overrun." She barely glanced at it. "The watering restrictions exist for a reason, Jack. Water conservation matters to this community." It ran 2 minutes past the limit because the valve sticks. I've told maintenance about it 3 times. Then perhaps you should fix your valve instead of arguing with me about it, she said, already looking past me at a woman haggling over a lamp 2 tables down, like this conversation was beneath her attention. What about the water main? Mr. Henderson said. We've got nothing. Nothing at all. Gail's face did this little flicker, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but I caught it because I've learned to watch for that specific look. It's the look of someone who already knows something and is deciding how much of it to admit. I'm sure it's just a temporary drop, she said. These older pipes fluctuate. I wouldn't worry about it. People are running a yard sale, I said. There's 100 strangers walking through here today. If somebody needs a bathroom, if somebody needs water for a kid who overheats, that's not a fluctuation, that's a problem. I'll look into it, she said, the universal HOA phrase for I will not look into it, and walked off toward her clipboard duties, probably to go measure someone's welcome mat for a compliance violation. I stood there next to Henderson, who just sighed and went back to his empty bucket. That's the thing about Gail Whitmore. She's not stupid. She knows exactly which battles to pick, and she picks the ones where she holds all the paperwork and residents don't. A sprinkler timer, sure. That's an easy win. It's black and white on a compliance sheet. Nobody's going to fight a $75 fine hard enough to matter. But a dead water main serving multiple units on a day with heavy foot traffic, that's a real liability. The kind that involves insurance and lawyers and county inspectors. And Gail's whole management style for 3 years had been to make sure none of that ever landed on her desk in a way she couldn't spin. I decided right there, standing in my driveway holding my own dumb little fine, that I was going to find out exactly why our water pressure had disappeared. And I was going to do it before somebody's kid passed out from heat in a driveway full of strangers, because the HOA president was too busy measuring compliance violations to call an actual plumber. By 11 that morning, the yard sale was in full swing, and so was the chaos. Cars were parked bumper to bumper along both sides of the internal road, which is maybe 18 feet wide on a good day, narrow enough that 2 cars can pass each other only if everybody holds their breath. People had folding tables spilling half into the fire lane that runs along the side of Building 3, the one clearly marked with faded yellow paint that says no parking fire lane, because apparently that paint is more of a suggestion than a rule around here. I'd been to enough calls in my career to know what a blocked fire lane looks like from a truck's perspective, and looking down that lane with cars nosed halfway into it and tables crowding the rest, my stomach did a slow, familiar drop. That's not a yard sale inconvenience. That's the kind of thing that gets people killed when seconds count. I found the source of the new congestion pretty quickly. Somebody, and I didn't have to guess who, had put up a fresh set of laminated signs along that lane just that week. Resident parking only, assigned SBACES violators TOWED. Except there weren't enough assigned spaces to go around in the first place. Everybody knew that, which meant on any normal day half the complex was already parking wherever they could find room, including that lane, because the alternative was parking 3 streets over and walking. And on yard sale day, with visitors on top of residents, that lane had become the only overflow space left. I flagged down Dana, who was manning her table of old picture frames and a suspiciously large collection of ceramic frogs. Did Gail put these signs up? Last week, Dana said. She said the fire department complained about clutter. That made me pause because I happened to know for a fact nobody from my department had filed any complaint like that, not recently, not that I'd heard of. She said the fire department complained. That's what the notice said. Compliance and Safety Committee something something. You know how she writes those things, 3 paragraphs to say move your car. I didn't love where my brain was going with that, but I filed it away, because right then I had a bigger problem walking toward me. Mrs. Alvarez, 70-something, lived in Building 3, was standing at the edge of her driveway looking pale and unsteady, fanning herself with a paper flyer. Sweat soaked through her collar even though it wasn't unbearably hot yet. Just enough sun and humidity to be dangerous for somebody her age standing outside for hours helping her daughter run a table. "Mrs. Alvarez, you okay?" I called over. She waved me off, the way people who are absolutely not okay always do, and then her knees just kind of folded, slow motion, and her daughter screamed and caught her halfway down. I was there in about 4 seconds flat, old training kicking in before my brain finished processing what I was seeing. Pulse was there but fast, skin hot and dry in patches, not sweating enough anymore, which in my line of work is a bad sign, not a good one. Heat exhaustion tipping toward heat stroke, and she needed actual medical attention, not a garden hose and a fan. "Somebody call 911, I said, loud enough for the whole lot to hear, and 3 phones came out at once. Here's the part that still gets my blood up when I think about it. The ambulance made it to the entrance of Cedar Hollow in about 6 minutes, which is good. That's a good response time. And then it sat there. Because the fire lane along Building 3, the one clear route wide enough for an emergency vehicle to actually get down to that row of units, was blocked solid with cars and folding tables, and the internal road was jammed with yard sale traffic that had nowhere to pull aside because there was no shoulder left, no fire lane left, nothing. I ran out to the entrance myself, waving my arms like an idiot, screaming for people to move their cars, and it took almost 4 full minutes, 4 minutes I will never get back and neither will Mrs. Alvarez, to clear enough space for that ambulance to squeeze through at a walking pace. 4 minutes doesn't sound like much until you've watched someone's oxygen levels drop while you're standing there helpless because a laminated sign turned a fire lane into a parking lot. She made it. I want to say that clearly because I know how this sounds and I don't want anyone thinking otherwise. The paramedics got her cooled down, got fluids into her, and she recovered at the hospital over the next 2 days. But she made it in spite of Cedar Hollow's parking policy. Not because of it, and that difference matters enormously to a guy who spent 11 years learning exactly how much 4 minutes can cost. Gail showed up at the tail end of it all, clipboard still in hand, and when I told her flat out that her new resident parking only signs had blocked emergency access to a medical call, she looked at me like I'd insulted her personally. "That's an unfortunate coincidence," she said. "I'm sure the paramedics managed just fine." "They didn't manage just fine, Gail. They sat at the entrance for 4 minutes because your fire lane is full of cars and card tables." "The fire lane issue is not new, Jack. Residents have always parked there. I simply formalized the rule." "You formalized a rule that made it worse, not better. You put up signs saying resident parking only in a lane that's supposed to have 0 parking ever, and now everybody thinks it's fine to park there as long as they live here." She sniffed, actually sniffed, like I'd tracked mud into her clean argument. "I don't appreciate being lectured at during a community event, Jack. If you have concerns, bring them to the next board meeting like everyone else." And then she walked away to go tell somebody their yard sale banner violated the sign ordinance. That was the moment, standing there with my heart still going too fast from the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes, that I decided the next board meeting wasn't going to be soon enough. I was going to find out exactly what Gail Whitmore had actually done, on paper, in the county's records, because I had a hunch that a woman this confident about bending rules had probably done it in ways that were a lot more documentable than she thought. That night, once the yard sale wound down and the ambulance situation had calmed everybody's nerves into a low simmer of neighborhood outrage, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the county's online records portal, the same one I use for work sometimes when we're checking property access for pre-planning purposes. It's public record. Anybody can look at recorded plats, easements, ordinances, all of it. You just have to know what you're looking for and be stubborn enough to read through the boring parts. I started with the plat map for Cedar Hollow, the original recorded survey filed back when the complex was built. And there it was, plain as anything, a marked utility easement running along the side of Building 3, the exact stretch that had been fenced off and blocked by Gale's new signs. Fire Lane, clearly labeled, county required minimum width for emergency vehicle access, recorded and filed with the county decades before Gale Whitmore ever set foot in Cedar Hollow. That easement wasn't the HOA's to modify. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a legal requirement tied to the original building permit, meaning the HOA board had exactly zero authority to reassign that space as resident parking, laminated signs or not. I kept digging. Found the water main too, marked on the same plat, running underneath buildings 2 and 3 with a shared shutoff access point located, according to the drawing, right about where somebody had built a storage shed. I actually laughed out loud at my kitchen table alone at 11 at night because I knew exactly which shed that was. It was the HOA supply shed, the one Gale had commissioned about a year ago to store extra mulch bags and holiday decorations, the one she'd proudly announced at a board meeting as an improvement funded by community beautification reserves. That shed sat directly on top of the shared shutoff valve access point, according to a recorded county document that predated the shed by roughly 30 years. Which meant when the water pressure dropped that morning, whoever needed to get in and manually check or shut off that valve to diagnose the problem couldn't, not without tearing down a shed first. I pulled up the HOA's own financial disclosures next, the annual reserve fund report that gets mailed out once a year that nobody reads except me, apparently. The Beautification Reserve Fund had taken a $15,000 hit the previous spring for landscaping and storage improvements, paid to a company called Whitmore Ground Solutions LLC. Whitmore, same last name as our HOA president. I checked the state's business registry, because at this point I was fully committed to pulling every thread I could find, and sure enough, Whitmore Ground Solutions LLC was registered to a Daniel Whitmore, listed address matching Gale's own condo unit. Nephew, I found out later, though at the time I just knew it was somebody sharing her address and her last name getting paid $15,000 out of a fund that was supposed to cover shared infrastructure maintenance, including, presumably, the water main that was currently failing 3 buildings over. I sat back in my chair and let that settle. A recorded fire lane easement, illegally converted to resident parking. A water shutoff access point, illegally buried under a shed. Reserve funds meant for maintenance, redirected to a relative's LLC for a storage shed nobody actually needed. And on top of all that, a $75 fine for a sprinkler running 2 minutes long, mailed to the one resident who'd been asking too many questions. Because that part clicked too, once I thought about it. I'd been the one at the last board meeting 3 weeks earlier who'd asked politely why the reserve fund report showed a big landscaping expense with no competitive bids attached. Gale had brushed it off then, same as she'd brushed off everything else. And 2 weeks later, my sprinkler timer ran 2 minutes long, and I got a violation notice, while other residents with worse infractions never heard a word. I didn't have proof of retaliation, not the kind that holds up anywhere official, but I had a strong personal theory, and I had something better than a theory. I had documents, recorded plats, recorded easements, a business registry, a reserve fund report, all public record, all legally obtained, all sitting right there in black and white saying things Gale Whitmore very much did not want people connecting. The next morning, still buzzing off maybe 4 hours of sleep, I called the county's code enforcement office and asked specifically for whoever handled fire lane and utility access violations, because I've learned over the years that getting the right department on the first call saves you weeks of getting bounced around. I got connected to an inspector named Frank Dolan, and if you want to know what Frank Dolan sounds like, Imagine a man who has spent 20 years listening to homeowners associations complain about each other and has developed the vocal patience of a saint who is extremely tired of saints. Cedar Hollow, he said, before I'd even finished explaining. That's the one with the visor lady, right? You know Gail. I know the type. Every complex has one. Look, I get a dozen calls a week about neighbor drama, and 90% of it's nothing I can act on. What do you actually have? I told him. Fire lane easement recorded on the county plat, converted to resident parking with laminated signage, resulting in a documented emergency vehicle delay during an active medical call the day before. Water main shutoff access point buried under a structure built without, as far as I could find, a permit, and a reserve fund payment to a business owned by a relative of the HOA president. There was a pause on the line, and then Frank said, in a completely different tone than he'd started with, "You've got the plat number handy." "I do. Email me everything you just said, documents included. I'm not driving out there for a shed unless the paperwork backs it up. But if that's a real recorded easement getting blocked, that's not an HOA dispute anymore. That's a code violation with a public safety component, and those I take seriously." I emailed him that afternoon, attached the plat excerpt, the easement language, a photo of the blocked fire lane from the day before, and a screenshot of the reserve fund disclosure. He wrote back within 2 hours, 4 words that felt better than anything Gail had said to me in 3 years. "I'll be out Thursday." Thursday, as it happened, was also the day the HOA's plumber, an actual licensed plumber this time, not just Gail's clipboard and confidence, finally showed up to look at the water main, because by Tuesday 4 units had 0 pressure, and even Gail couldn't keep insisting it was a fluctuation when the Hendersons hadn't had running water for 3 straight days. I made sure to be home. Frank Dolan showed up first, driving a plain county truck, wearing a polo shirt with a badge clipped to it and the expression of a man who'd already decided this was going to be an annoying afternoon. He walked the fire lane with a tape measure and a clipboard of his own, took photos, checked his notes against the plat I'd sent him, and made a small, unimpressed grunt when he got to the shed. "That's sitting right on the access point," he said, mostly to himself. "You said this went up when?" "About a year ago," I said. "HOA called it a beautification improvement. Building permit. I couldn't find one filed for it. County records don't show anything." He wrote that down with the specific weight of a man adding a second violation to a growing list. That's when Gail arrived, visor and all, marching over the second she spotted the county truck like she'd sensed an intrusion into her territory from 3 buildings away. "Can I help you?" she said to Frank, in the tone she usually reserved for residents who'd painted their door the wrong shade of blue. "Frank Dolan, County Code Enforcement. You the HOA president?" "I am. Gail Whitmore." "I wasn't informed of any inspection." "You don't have to be, ma'am. It's a public easement." He said it flat, no heat behind it, just fact, and I watched Gail's whole posture shift, the way it does when someone realizes the person in front of them isn't going to be steered by tone of voice alone. "This fire lane is recorded on your original plat as a required minimum width emergency access corridor. Your parking signage here is in direct violation of that easement, and this shed appears to be sitting on a recorded utility access point without a permit on file." "That shed was approved by the board," Gail said. "The board doesn't have authority to override a recorded county easement, ma'am." Boards can set internal rules, sure, but they can't legislate away a legal access requirement, same as you can't vote to make your own stop sign optional. I'll admit I enjoyed that comparison more than I probably should have. Gail's jaw tightened. "This is a private community matter." "It was, until it delayed an ambulance," Frank said, checking his notes. "I've got a report here that a medical call on Saturday was held up roughly 4 minutes at your fire lane due to obstruction." "That's not private anymore. That's a documented public safety incident tied to an illegal use of a recorded easement." He looked up at her, not unkindly, just plain. "I'm going to need that shed relocated within 30 days. The fire lane cleared permanently, and I'll be filing this with a formal violation notice to the HOA board, not to any individual resident. You can't just, I can and I am, Frank said, already writing. I stood there off to the side, arms crossed, trying very hard not to smile too obviously, because I still had a sprinkler fine in my kitchen drawer and I hadn't forgotten about it, not for 1 second. The plumber's van pulled in about 20 minutes later, right as Frank was finishing up his notes, and this is where things really started moving fast, because the plumber, a heavyset guy named Ron who'd clearly done this exact job 100 times, took one look at the shed sitting over the marked access point and said the words that made the whole thing unavoidable. I can't diagnose this without getting to that valve. If that shed's sitting on it, I need it moved today, not in 30 days. If that main's cracked underneath, you've got units without water indefinitely and possible ground saturation that could undermine the foundation nearby. Frank looked at Gail. You heard the man. I'll need to consult the board about moving HOA property, Gail said, and I want you to understand, she said this with the water main still actively failing, 3 buildings still without pressure, a licensed inspector standing on her recorded violation, and a plumber telling her the situation could get structurally serious if it waited. Ma'am, Ron said, not unkindly, your board doesn't get a vote on a burst main. I need that shed moved in the next hour or I'm calling the county water department myself, and they'll move it for you and bill you for the privilege. That's when the rest of the neighborhood started gathering, because by this point word had spread through group chats faster than any of us could keep up with, and half of Cedar Hollow came out to their driveways or wandered over on the pretense of walking a dog, phones already up and recording. Because if there's one thing a community that just survived a blocked fire lane medical scare loves, it's watching the person responsible get cornered by actual authority. Gail, to her credit or maybe just her stubbornness, didn't fold immediately. She turned to the small crowd gathering and said, loud enough for everyone, "This is a coordinated attack on this board's decisions. I built that structure for the good of this community. With whose money?" I said, and I hadn't planned to say it out loud, it just came out because I was tired and I had the reserve fund report practically memorized at that point. Excuse me, $15,000 out of the reserve fund, paid to Whitmore Ground Solutions LLC, registered to Daniel Whitmore, same address as your unit. I pulled the printed page out of my back pocket because I'd started carrying it around like a weapon, which honestly at that point it was. That's the reserve fund every resident here pays into, meant for shared infrastructure. Used to build a shed over the exact spot the plumber now needs to access to fix our water main, over an easement Frank here says was never legally available for HOA use in the first place. The crowd had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens right before everyone starts talking at once. That contract was competitively bid, Gail said, but her voice had lost about half its earlier volume. Was it? Frank asked, and I watched him actually pull out a small notepad, the kind you use when you're not just doing code enforcement anymore. Because if reserve funds tied to a mandatory HOA assessment were directed to a business owned by a relative without a documented bid process, that's not a code violation anymore, ma'am. That's potentially a financial matter for the county attorney, not me. I'll be noting that in my report as well. Gail's face had gone from confident to pale in about the time it takes to say reserve fund. Dana, standing near her yard sale table which was long since packed up, muttered just loud enough for people nearby to hear, "That's why my dues went up last year." "They went up for everyone," someone else added. 15 grand for a shed, Henderson said, shaking his head, "while my toilet doesn't flush." Ron the plumber, entirely unbothered by the unfolding neighborhood reckoning happening around him, said, "So are we moving the shed or am I calling the water department?" Gail looked around at maybe 15 of her neighbors, all watching her, several with phones raised, and I watched something in her finally break, not into an apology. Gail Whitmore doesn't really do apologies, but into a kind of resigned retreat. "Move it," she said quietly. "I'll call maintenance." It took 4 guys about 40 minutes with a hand truck and a lot of complaining to shift the shed 6 feet to the side, revealing a rusted metal access panel that had clearly not been opened in a very long time. Ron popped it, checked the valve, found exactly what he suspected: a corroded joint that had been slowly failing for months, worsened by ground shifting near the shed's foundation footings that had been poured, without permit, directly adjacent to the water infrastructure. "You're lucky this didn't go earlier," Ron said. "Another few weeks and you'd have had a real flood, not just low pressure." He had the main patched and pressure restored to all 3 buildings within 2 hours, which, frankly, made me want to throw a small party. And several neighbors basically did exactly that, standing around in the parking lot cheering when Henderson's hose finally sputtered back to life with full pressure. But the story doesn't quite end there, because 2 days later, at a hastily called emergency board meeting that Gale tried and failed to keep small, county records came back further confirming what Frank had flagged. The shed had gone up without any building permit at all, a separate violation from the easement issue. The $15,000 contract had no documented competitive bidding process on file anywhere in the HOA's own required records, a direct violation of the association's bylaws requiring bids over a certain dollar threshold. And when a state auditor got looped in after the county attorney's office received Frank's report, they found 2 additional payments over the prior year to the same LLC, smaller amounts, routine lawn contracts that could have gone to any licensed landscaper in the county but had instead gone, again, to Gale's nephew, without bids, without board votes properly recorded in the minutes. That last part was the one that actually got the county attorney's office moving with real weight behind it, because when they pulled the HOA's recorded meeting minutes to check whether those contracts had been approved by vote like the bylaws required, they found the minutes had been altered. Not subtly, either. The digital file's edit history, which somebody on the board had apparently never thought to check, showed the vote language for the shed and landscaping contracts had been added in after the fact, months after the meetings they claimed to document, with Gale's account listed as the last editor. That's the difference between a bad HOA decision and an actual crime. And once the county attorney's office confirmed the falsified records tied to embezzled association funds, this stopped being a neighborhood dispute entirely and became a police matter. 2 detectives came out about 3 weeks after the water main got fixed, met with several board members, including Gale, and by the end of that month she'd been formally charged with embezzlement and falsifying association records, the kind of charges that come with actual court dates, not just angry Facebook posts in the neighborhood group. She was removed from the board immediately, obviously, replaced on an emergency basis by a rotating committee of residents that included, somewhat to my own surprise, me, mostly because I was the guy holding all the documents everyone else wanted copies of. The restitution process took a few months to sort out, but it happened. The county required repayment of the misdirected reserve funds, with Daniel Whitmore's LLC agreeing to return a portion as part of a settlement to avoid its own separate fraud exposure. And the HOA's insurance covered part of the emergency plumbing costs, since the underlying failure was tied to unpermitted construction, which meant it qualified differently than routine maintenance. And my sprinkler fine. I brought that up specifically at the first meeting of the new interim committee, mostly out of principle at that point, because $75 was never really the issue. Turns out, when we actually pulled the county's water conservation ordinance that Gale's rule claimed to be based on, the county's actual watering window that summer, under the seasonal water management plan on file, ran from 5:00 a.m. to 7:00 a.m., not 6:00 to 6:30 like Gale's laminated notice claimed. Her 30-minute window had never matched the county ordinance at all. She'd apparently just made up a stricter version years ago, and nobody had ever bothered checking it against the actual county rule, because who reads irrigation ordinances for fun? I do, apparently now. My fine got voided along with, once people started checking, about a dozen other sprinkler fines issued that same summer to residents who'd been well within the real county watering window the whole time, and had just been paying fake fines for years because nobody thought to question the visor lady with the clipboard. The new committee refunded every one of those, along with a chunk of other disputed fines going back 2 years that turned out to have similarly shaky legal grounding, once we actually checked them against recorded ordinances and bylaws, instead of Gail's personal interpretation of both. We also finally repainted that fire lane, bright and unmistakable this time, and posted the actual recorded easement language on a sign right next to it, mostly so nobody could ever again pretend they didn't know it was there. The new parking plan added 12 additional spaces by reclaiming a stretch of dead lawn nobody used anyway, which solved the overflow problem that had caused the whole mess in the first place, the kind of obvious fix that apparently just needed someone other than Gail willing to actually look at it. Mrs. Alvarez came home from her follow-up appointment about a week after everything settled down and made a point of stopping by my unit with a plate of homemade empanadas, which is a much better outcome for a volunteer firefighter than most calls end with, honestly. "You're the one who got the lane cleared," she said. "My daughter told me. 4 minutes," she said. She counted. "I just made some phone calls," I said, though we both knew it was more than that. "Sprinklers," she said, shaking her head, half smiling. "They fined you for sprinklers while my ambulance couldn't get through." "Yeah," I said, "about sums up how this whole place was being run." The following month's yard sale, the makeup one the new committee organized partly to celebrate getting the fire lane and parking situation actually fixed, ran smoother than any Cedar Hollow event I could remember. Cars parked where they were supposed to. The fire lane stayed clear the entire day, wide open and unmistakable with its fresh yellow paint. Water pressure held steady in every building. Dana sold the rest of her ceramic frogs. Henderson manned a grill in his driveway instead of hauling water in a bucket. And somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, my sprinklers kicked on for their evening test cycle, ran their full course, shut off exactly on schedule, and not one single person in that entire complex cared even a little bit. Because, for the first time in a long time, Cedar Hollow actually had bigger things worth caring about than 2 minutes of sprinkler runoff, and every single one of us was better off for it.